Greetings, citizens, and welcome to Political Viewpoint. I'm your host, Eric, and on today's episode, we're going to be covering the theories of liberalism and neoliberalism. This will serve both as an in-depth and introductory level course because, realistically, the theories of liberalism and neoliberalism are rather new in comparison to realism, and they've been around relatively. It's the younger of the schools of thought and approach to policy making out of the two. Functionalism and constructivism, even more nuanced approaches. So, in spirit of what we did with the series on realism, we're going to be offering just this one big course on liberalism and neoliberalism to you for free. Knowledge is power, and this channel is all about bringing as much knowledge and by that political power and capability to the everyday citizen out there. So it's really more aligned with our mission statement in terms of bringing this material to you for free. This is material that people pay thousands of dollars to get in terms of a formal education. So this is pretty good. We're really happy to bring this to you guys. So anyways, just like with the other presentations, feel free to click pause as we go through the slides and just read them for yourself if you're more comfortable that way, especially if you are a political scientist or someone who's familiar with the material and just wanting to brush up on it. Other than that, this one is going to be a lot more cursory. It's pretty self-explanatory, especially the points on the slides. So I'm just going to be giving some more kind of concrete, real-world examples that go along with what's already on the screen for you guys, just for the sake of time and that we're able to go through it a little bit quicker and more efficiently. All right, so let's get started. So some of the main ideas that percolate and come about later, when liberalism established itself as a proper school of thought and approach to policymaking, is John Locke. A lot of his essays and writings and what are called treatises come from the late 17th century. So mainly the 1680s and 90s is when a lot of his works were published. And that's when he was already at the age of 60. So a lot of his introspections and his beliefs and ideologies, particularly revolving around individuals and their relation to the state and the relationship to individuals, ends up being key cornerstones to the development of political liberalism. And mind you, this is different than just ideological liberalism or what you would consider a liberal/conservative, because these are completely different constructs. Like I said, this liberalism in political science is something that's used, throughout mainly the Western world and the Western kind of academia and political science training. So yes. Anyways, liberalism, it's both a theory of government within the states and of good governance between states or people worldwide. And what liberalism seeks is the projecting of a certain set of values. Currently, that set of values has to do with personal liberties, justice within the state and towards all individuals and for all individuals, and a lot of kind of tolerance within the political science community and within politics. And for liberalism, the way that these values can be projected and spread as well as protected throughout the world and throughout the state and within each and every one of us, as it's argued, is that the institutions, international ones especially, are needed in order to do exactly this. in order to percolate these ideas top to bottom, left to right, so laterally, throughout all sectors of society, not just government. So, as I mentioned in the realism lessons, the real major development point and where liberalism gets fleshed out in the field is the interwar period. Okay, so 1920s to 30s. As you can recall, realism during the First World War, because of the total war, had a much more strong foothold, especially given the long, antiquated, classical literature and foundation that it had. So liberalism, other than John Locke, kind of came from a position of not such a history, not such a storied position, okay? And after the First World War, and all the existential crisis that came with that, and kind of people's wish to divert from the things that brought them to such a conflict and horrific death and destruction, they wanted a complete and utter shift from that sort of big empire, for the, statehood, nationalism ideas. So this is really where the liberal mentality and the idealistic views of humanity kind of come out from that dark period of time in history. So kind of the idea is that, warfare is something that's unnecessary, and settling disputes can be done not through violence and things of this nature. Think of all the major existential writers that came out of this period of time, mainly in English literature. You can think of a good play, Waiting for Godot is an existential one that is spawned from this period of time. A lot of Hemingway stuff, A Call to Arms, but that's mainly after the Second World War, but we'll get to that. All right, moving on anyways. So obviously there's a lot of variations in the set of values and the institutions for liberalism. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, like I said, this goes back to realism in terms of understanding that one country's morals are not universal. So that's an inherent truth, even in the case of liberalism. There is a great variation in the set of values, and thus how many institutions and what the institutions push or stand for. In terms of liberalism, there's so many different camps in the liberalism camp, and it's very heated debate within themselves, let alone against different opinions such as realism, functionalism, and constructivism in the field. And a lot of these debates center around main topics such as the causes of war and what kinds of institutions are required in order to implement values, whatever they may be. So, whereas, the realists, on comparison, have Clausewitz that kind of lays out the whole, in his work on war. The liberalism school of thought, not so concrete, a lot more all over the place, shotgun. And again, what type of institutions are required? What do we mean by this? Mainly in the main debates that exist in liberalism are about those three pillars that govern state behavior. So if it's dominance, if it's reciprocity, or if it's identity. Main issues with liberalism. Liberals definitely want to stay away from the dominance hierarchy of things, They don't like institutions that go top down, but they do like ones that go grassroots, bottom up. And, and then on the flip side, I'd say the strongest one that a lot of political science liberalists are strong proponents of or for are the lateral types of institutions, so multi-level governance, things that move in the direction of reciprocity. If you remember that, how in that chart, that's how that system works to maintain the balance of power and all that. And especially, we see this a lot more in Western countries such as the UK, the United States, although there's a lot of debate about that right now and different views, and especially Canada, for the identity approach, especially from political science liberalists in their policymaking along the lines of the identity politics. So if you remember that from the chart, bringing the environment in towards the identity group to then make policies targeting said identity groups and giving certain rights and promoting certain values and strengthening and protecting certain values and rights for those identity groups, minority groups, as you will. So kind of trying to give you guys a decent introduction and where you can already see this policy-making approach in action in the world around you, wherever you may be. So lastly, an important thing to know about the school of thought and the approach of liberalism is the positive and the negative conception. Okay, so positive liberalism, they advocate for interventionist type of foreign policies and stronger international institutions. Okay, so this is kind of liberalism with teeth. Okay, these are ones that, do understand that militaries are necessary parts of the state and they need to use them in this manner. On the flip side, though, too, instead of having to use the military, they just believe on thus having a very strong diplomatic force that can be reckoned with and that's effective out there in the international field, and likewise strong international institutions that allow a state or allow the world just in general to be able to be effective at implementing these policies at larger levels, larger scales that perhaps individual states cannot do. And kind of taking initiative to get down, get in there, and get working. The negative type of liberalism, and this type of negative liberalism, they prioritize, again, toleration and non-intervention. So to say, this is one of the classifications in the field that I don't personally, as a political scientist, agree with the designation of something being positive or negative because of the stigma that comes with those two words. Like, means is that this is the kind of approach, if you could even call it that, of being tolerant towards actions that are being done towards you or in the international community, and not getting yourself involved and letting it play out for the sake of respect and and for free will. I mean, it comes from a place, it does come from an ideological place of caring and empathy, but also mainly this, like I said, respect, and especially free will is a big thing in there in terms of allowing individuals, but also individual states, and thus individual state actors like institutions to do whatever they're doing, to take their actions, and then having faith in either the legal system or the international community at large to then do what it will do if there's any repercussions that need to come from that, or that will come from that. It'll occur naturally, and the whole mentality that, like, let nature take its course, be tolerant to other people, or be tolerant to other countries, other institutions, whatever they're doing. Try not to stir the pot too much, and, we shouldn't have to intervene, and we just worry about ourselves and trying to be the best that we can be and spreading the values that we want to spread, and things will, people will decide the course of things. So the reason why I believe this is considered negative, of course, there's a lot of people, even from the liberal school of thought, that think that this is not a valid approach or a very strong one to politics and policy making. It's too laid back, it's too lackadaisical, and kind of, especially for realists, this is opening the floodgates to allow anarchy and chaos to reign supreme. So I believe this is why this is considered a negative approach, or the negative conception of political liberalism. So, like I said, depending where you sit on the fence on that one, you may agree or disagree. I just think, personally, on my end of things, just the naming, the classification of those two as positive and negative could just be changed to something else a little bit more objective. Other than that, it is what it is. It's theory or ideas that are in liberalism. So some of the early liberal thought is the fact around the natural order of things. Okay, this needs to be done because, like I said, realism is already a very well-established school of thought in political science at this period of time. And in fact, it was the realists that were pushing for political science to be a field in and of itself, right? So the liberalist thinkers had a mountainous task in front of them in terms of trying to establish themselves as their own school of thought. And in order to do that, they need to engage with the present dominant school of thought and founding fathers, if you will, of the realists and realism. So they need to have similarities and talk about similar things, of course, in order to be a valid alternative approach to policymaking that policymakers can follow and undertake. So for them, natural order is corrupted by undemocratic states and state leaders, and having outdated policies that don't maintain and keep up with the balance of power in the international, in the local, in all the levels of the systems, okay? So liberalism is, as you'll find out, and I'll explain it, very extremely tied into democracy, and liberal democracy in particular. That's why I do say that, liberals and Democrats, depending what country you're in, right? Especially, Canada, there's 3 parties. In the States, there's 2. The UK, there's many different union parties. And, Western Europe, the list is large, okay? So it's not so clear-cut like that all, liberals, depending on exactly which country you're in, what can be considered a liberal and what the Liberal Party calls itself. And it's very different than what political science liberalists are. But they tend to go hand in hand, and what their theory revolves around are liberal democracies, okay? So for them, this concept of anarchy or chaos, though they don't call it this, they call it the natural order. You can have a corrupted natural order where things are going wrong and, all this bloodshed and violence happens because of undemocratic states or leaders. So tyrants or, for liberalists, communism, oligarchies, all these, okay? And having, like I said, outdated policies that don't keep you, don't maintain the balance of power and don't keep you perhaps at the pinnacle of a dominance hierarchy, all these type of things. So the Enlightenment liberals, they're kind of seen as cosmopolitan, okay? So for liberalists, the concept of morality comes very heavy-handedly into play. In fact, it's one of their strong arguments, especially against the realist school of thought, which tries to separate morality from politics, right? That objective law, that objective decision-making. For liberalists, morality in politics and in political science and in policy making is possible if you use reason and if you have constitutional states and a constitution and an unfettered movement of people and goods. So right here, for those of us who might be more immediately politically inclined, you can see that this right here seems very much like a free trade, liberal economic based approach to policymaking, and you are absolutely correct to assume that. So reason, as you can see, that's kind of something that's pretty easily taken from the realist school of thought. So, they say morality can come through reason and through, objectivity, and having that sort of ability to think critically. Realists think that the only way that you can think critically and effectively is by separating morality and emotion out of the equation. For the liberals, they just say the opposite, that the only way to act morally is by using reason, and in order to act reasonably, you have to have be acting towards some sort of moral aim. So the importance of constitutional states. The Constitution, whatever it may be, is that objective criteria that will guide you and what will be your moral compass when you are doing the policies and making the policies that have to be in line with that sort of moral truth that has been, set in stone for the given country or state or community that has been built. So that's how the liberals answer that question, and kind of have a counter for realist thought in regards to having objective criteria and making objective decisions. So that's how they can make moral, decisions that are in good moral standing but still be objective, is by having those first two things. And the unfettered movement of people and goods, the free trade aspect, is definitely something that's just taken from that sort of liberal economic perspective. Like I said, depending on which side of the fence that you're on this one, you can see different sort of perspectives in terms of why this might be important or not. Okay, so moving on. Moving on to some more of the core ideas of liberalism and neoliberalism. So, for both schools of thought, key component of how the policies go from a piece of paper down onto the ground and get implemented is through international organizations. They are the key actors that will facilitate the peaceful exchange, things like disarmament, arbitration, and where necessary, enforcement of the policies and upholding the values and the morality. So where this starts and gets put into concrete presence is through the first experiment of the League of Nations in the interwar period. This is a project by Woodrow Wilson, and it's the first attempt at collective security. And it failed ultimately because it failed because it failed to prevent a descent into the World War. In fact, a lot of the things that happened in the League of Nations proved that it was nothing more than rhetoric, and that that nations at the end of the day found a way to actually abuse that system for a lot of military gain, and a lot of bad things happen through there. The second attempt is the UN. Okay, so that built in 1945. The Universal Charter. The vast majority of all the countries on this planet are members of this international organization, and there is a focus of the great powers having voting control and a lot more control over this international organization rather than traditional enforcement. And by traditional enforcement, I mean military compliance and things of that nature. So, like I said, depending on what side of the fence you sit on this, that's either, it's either been a great thing or an effective tool, or, again, it's just lip service and a lot of rhetoric and not a lot of substance. So, again, that is a thing for your own opinions and perspectives. So, moving forward, after kind of the Second World War, there's a strong increase in international institutions that is catalyzed by integration theory that is coming out of Europe, and then it's called pluralism in the US. This idea of this kind of multilateral approach to politics, and it goes a lot more along the lines of reciprocity if we look back at our table on core tenets that govern state behavior. Okay, so that kind of lateral policy making. And then another big time period for liberal school of thought is the 1970s, because that's really when this idea of pluralism in the U.S. becomes more of a significant challenge to the traditional school of thought of realism. Okay, and that's because there's some pretty big, heavy-hitting new actors that come into play in the 1970s, okay? Transnational corporations, NGOs. The biggest one to think of, especially in the 1970s, is OPEC, okay? To this day, a very extremely powerful organization that, the world economy is based off of. And beyond just OPEC, we're talking things like NATO. We're talking about things like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. These are organizations that control the world economy, and that countries go to for loans and that are in debt to. And that ultimately, one way or another are dictating a lot of economic, social, and political events that are occurring around the world. And this is where like I said, this is where the big significant challenge occurred to realism that, if you recall, is very state-centric, and that states are the primary actors that influence all things political. This is really where this starts to get challenged, because there's huge, big-hitting actors that are being set up that are transnational and that are non-government organizations, NGOs, right? So this kind of brings with that new patterns of interaction in the political arena, okay? That, this idea of like kind of interdependence and integration really starts coming into play, and especially the economic principle of globalization and things along those nature, okay? Where states have to be working with other states and other non-state actors all on similar issues. And if you remember what these issues are called, a lot of them happen to be collective goods problems, right? And that's where the liberal school of thought and approach to policymaking really started to take off and become a lot more not just prevalent in terms of policymaking, but a lot more poignant and relevant, actually relevant to the world around it and things that were happening and going on. So neoliberalism, little bit of a departure from this traditional liberalism, from the 1970s on is where neoliberalism comes into place, and it's a lot more sophisticated on trying to tackle that theoretical challenge to contemporary realism, and especially the structural realism, the neo-realism that came out from 1977, if you recall from the last lecture, where Kenneth Waltz set up the new structural realist school of thought, the neo-realism. So this is where now, 1970s was a pretty strong period of time for liberalism with all that was going on. And then Kenneth Waltz comes in and constructs essentially a new subdivision and a new school of thought of realism that was even more an answer and poignant and kind of to keep up with the times of things going on. So thus, the liberal school of thought needed to do the same. So this is where we see a lot more of the lines starting to become blurred between the two schools of thought, and that's because, well, they do have to address similar core issues, because, if we go back all the way to the first lesson on things that are governing state behavior, there's 3 pillars. So both of these schools of thought are trying to address those pillars in their own separate ways and to have distinct approaches to dealing with those issues. But there is some overlap happening now, as we see in the comparison between the two. And that's because, and we'll see that later, but that's because some things are, I guess, starting to become seen as more universal. So now neoliberalism, shares a lot of some core assumptions that realists traditionally do or would have. So the major difference, however, between the two is how the international institutions are viewed, okay? So neoliberalists say that, despite changes in the context of the international political system, there's going to be durability for international institutions. So what do we mean by this statement, okay? That's the statement made by the realists that, in particular, Waltz, that, even with collective goods problems and even with international organizations and globalization, states are still influencing and, they're adapting to that new system, and they're finding ways to act in their own self-interest and to act rationally. And in fact, a lot of the state actors are setting up these international organizations and puppeteering them. And like I said, depending on where you are on the fence on that one, and, what you consider to be, well, what is factual and what is not is kind of a hard one to determine on that. But that's kind of the argument by the realists when it comes to the international arena. And for the liberalists, they just argue that, with the continued presence of these international organizations, it's showing the opposite, that, there's still this strong core of interdependence and, movement away from, purely state action and state actors. So, the argument for them would be the fact that, unlike the League of Nations, like the UN is still around and it's still doing things and is still, in their eyes effective at the mission, and the mission is, spreading and protecting the core set of values that the UN seeks to go after, whatever that might be. Furthermore, so another argument that the neoliberalists, I should say, are making is that international institutions is what makes cooperation on these collective goods problems possible. Without having these sort of large conglomerations that have lots of different interested parties, investors, and that are all non-state actors, without that, a lot of the cooperation would not be possible. And their argument is because, it's kind of like a slap in the face for realists, is because they're non-state actors. If states are uncomfortable to work with a particular other state directly on a global issue, then this kind of seemingly neutral party that is a conglomeration of lots of different individuals, they might be more willing to work with them on this issue, even if that other state is involved in it, but they know that, there's this neutral party that's governing this and looking after this, so you can kind of take it and fly from there. The other argument that they have is that the institutions are shaping the state preferences and are actually locking them into these cooperative arrangements. So again, that's exactly kind of the example exactly what I was explaining. So these institutions are mediating, but also creating a medium for the states to act in and to act in cooperative terms towards solving these collective goods issues in a way that it serves the state's self-interests, but at the same time is accomplishing something far more wide-reaching and more along the lines of the reciprocity system rather than just feeding into the dominance hierarchy. Okay, another big thing, like I said, I mentioned this, teased this earlier, but for neoliberalism and liberalism, and just this approach to policymaking, democratic peace theory is the secret sauce. Okay, it is the number one thing that governs a lot of the policies that are drafted and made. And I mean, we could do a whole small video on the democratic peace theory itself. It's a nice, quick theory to cover. But to sum it up in one simple line, it's the idea that liberal democracies, they do not fight each other. And this is based off of a lot of evidence and, comparative, a lot of comparative politics and comparative analysis that's been done in the field of comparative politics, that throughout history, liberal democratic states, like actual ones that, not states that just say that they're liberal democracy, such as the cases that could be argued for the Russian Federation, but nonetheless, that liberal democratic states do not fight each other because the fact that they share similar values, similar political beliefs, political systems, and that their people operate and their individuals operate and think similarly, and have kind of this, especially liberal democracies tend to have a different, more negative view of war and violence and this sort of thing. But if you look at it though, that's the caveat to the democratic peace theory. Like I said, it's not the same logic for even like-minded non-liberal states, okay? So, what are the implications from that? Like I said, a like-minded, non-liberal state, what is a good one that we can think of? That would be, the Scandinavian countries. They are, for the most part, vastly social democratic states, not liberal democratic states, and how their policies are, Okay, so then, what are the implications of that then? Does this logic hold true? Like, would Norway go to war with Canada, for example? Would Denmark go to war with Canada? They have that one island that they're always dropping liquor off out in the Arctic, and these are questions that the liberal and neoliberal schools of thought cannot answer currently. So, and kind of a big open wound that's just kind of sitting there when it comes to the democratic peace theory. So, and another, it's a core idea, but it's because it's a core critique of the school of thought of liberalism, is the idea that it's liberalism of privilege, okay? especially in the U.S. The U.S. has been a hegemonic power for quite a few, well, it depends on how you want to argue it, but at least 100 years, at least, okay? And the ramifications that come with that is that you have been in a position of privilege, regardless of where you sit on the social economic totem pole in the United States. You are in a position of privilege living in that country that has enjoyed being in a strong political dominant position on the dominance hierarchy, and there's ramifications that come with that. And in this argument is the fact that liberalism is one of those ramifications, and it comes from the privilege of being in a strong position that, a political realist would argue came from realism in the first place, and that liberalism is this privileged, entitled kind of spawn that came out of what they worked hard and what a state worked hard to create in the first place. So kind of this idea that liberalism and neoliberalism is spawned out of a time of peace, prosperity, and not knowing the harsh realities that is the natural state of the world, as a realist would argue, the state of anarchy and chaos. So that's why liberalism and neoliberalism struggles with the problems of inequality, power structures, and the possibility of intervention. Possibility of intervention, we'd already covered that in terms of there being a split in liberalists' approach, one that's, in my mind, right, wrongfully classified as positive or negative types of intervention, right? We already talked about that duality. Liberalism struggles with power structures and explaining them and how to get rid of them or come up with nuanced ones, because again, they try to go along the lines of the pillar of reciprocity and identity rather than dominance, right? And if they do try to come up with policies that are in line or address the pillar of dominance of state behavior, they try and go grassroots and bottom up and never and try to stay away from top down unless it's a very positive. Usually they'll do that when it comes to spreading and cementing moral values inside of a society. You can think of the Obama administration. Like I said, it doesn't matter what side of the fence that you're leaning on, but that's some of the big things that he did coming into office. A lot of those were definitely in line with ideological and moral and ethical viewpoints in mind, and he went and did it top down, making executive orders and then it carrying down into everyday society, things like the Defense of Marriage Act and allowing homosexuals the right of marriage and immigration and all the things that came with that. That's just a prime, simple, quick example of that, and kind of how the neoliberals try to do that in terms of for power structures and like the dominance pillar. So it's possible, but like I said, they generally struggle with these problems when faced with them. Moving on, big topic for liberalism and neoliberalism is the idea of collective security and defense. Okay, so what's collective security for liberalists and neoliberalists? Okay, that's that each state in the collective is accepting that the security of one is the concern of all, and they agree to making a collective response to any aggression. Does this sound familiar to any international organization to you guys? Well, I certainly hope so. If not, I'll let you know. It is NATO. An attack against one is an attack against all and will be responded by the collective force of the Union. Okay? So NATO is a prime example of liberalist / neoliberalist collective security and defense theory and policy making in action. Right there. NATO. Easiest one you can think of. Collective defense, it's an alliance. Okay? So that's where lots of states join together to respond to a specific threat or a specific issue. Okay, so it's a little bit different. Security is always ongoing, and it's something that you invest into collectively, and it's a collective goods problem, absolutely hands down, the idea of security. And, collective defense is kind of one of those one-time things for a specific issue or event. Okay? So now the last part, and it's probably one of the most important parts for understanding this school of thought and this approach to policymaking, is how liberalism regards the individual. So liberalism and neoliberalism, they believe that individual rights are the cornerstone for policymaking and for their own political thought. The rights of the individual are of extreme importance, and what they target. They target at trying to bring those values that they want to see exuded in every single individual. Because what they believe is that a strong state will be made up of strong individuals. So you have to focus on each and every individual and making them the strongest version of themselves in order to have that strong state. Now, the thing is, for political liberalists, they get to dictate what that is. So that's kind of where a lot of the counter arguments are from other schools of thought: realist, functionalist, constructivist, all school of thought, even cursory observers and philosophers. It's kind of a big ethical issue on a school of thought that strives to uphold what is seemingly a moral high ground all the time. And like I said, this depends exactly on what side of the fence you're on. Trying to just give this and showcase this for you. Like I said, it's neither here or there for me personally as a presenter. I'm just presenting it. But this is one of the main kind of counter arguments to this idea of where kind of liberal or neoliberal policymaking in action is actually something that's highly unethical, because, for the liberalists and the neoliberalists, like I said, the Constitution is that objective criteria that then governs, okay, this is the morally accepted truth that's universal for our state, right? And you can already see the divides with realism right there. But regardless, this is the moral truth for our state. And this is what we want to, think of Plato and Plato's Republic, right? This is the idea that we need to be striving towards. We may not achieve it, but this is what we need to be striving towards to be the strongest state that we possibly can be. Okay, so in order to get that, what kind of individuals do we need to be in order to get that? And then that's what the policymakers then go and try and do, and enact policies that would enable for us all as individuals to not only believe but take part in activities and we're governed by laws, and we're motivated to act in ways that would make us the strongest versions of ourselves that fit into that criteria and that mold that are governed by that Constitution, to then create the strongest state that is possible. So that's where you can kind of see where this school of thought does teeter more towards what is traditionally considered, Italian fascism, and that's very supranationalistic ideas of a very strong state being embedded in, very strong personal qualities of every single individual. So that's just a counter argument that exists out there, and an important one to think of when you think about the possible repercussions for liberalism and neoliberalist thought and how it is enacted. like I said, if you're on the other side of the fence, you can completely agree that this is perhaps the only way that we can try and make a better world is by doing this kind of a positive brainwashing, if you will. On the flip side to this, though, the liberals do realize that it is important, in order for the grand scheme of things to work out, and for ideas to spread, and for things to be defended, and liberty and justice to be properly adhered to or given, or whatever you want to say, is that the needs of an individual and certain liberties do need to be sacrificed for the greater good of the community. So, right away, you guys can think of Spock from Star Trek, and his famous line on that one, right? So that right there is liberalist and neo-liberalist thought when it sometimes come to the community, and that's a very bipolar kind of mentality to have. And again, that's why liberalist and neo-liberalist thought struggles with inequality and with power structures, because that right there is diverting thoughts on either bottom up or top down approach. Because top down approach for that is, with the community being of a higher importance than the individual, but at the same time, individual rights are the cornerstone to their political thought. So it kind of puts things at odds right away, and this is why discussion within liberalism is so heated and debated constantly. So, and this is one of the big contrasts with realism, and especially how international institutions are understood, because in the international institutions in particular, are we then sacrificing individual liberties of individuals around the world, or just individual states, in order for the collective good? Think of international organizations, again, like the UN, the G7, things along those lines, right? The G7 is a really good argument, the counter argument to make to showcase this point here. So G7, right? 7 of the more economically and politically powerful countries in the world coming together on big collective goods issues, and trying to problem solve and brainstorm. That's excluding, 180 some other points of view and, potential liberties and things of that nature that are being sacrificed, for the, ultimately for potentially the greater sake of the global community, right? So that's kind of one of those, it's an hyperbole, but it's a point that can be made to illustrate this kind of counter argument and kind of the contrast between how international institutions are understood, and especially, I already explained it throughout this slide, but the contrast to realism, on how realism deals and views the individual in the grand scheme of things. So one way or another, thank you for joining us here on Political Viewpoint. You can check out our Patreon page in the link below for all the latest updates and upcoming articles and videos that will be coming out. This concludes the liberalism and neoliberalism lesson. Again, we'd really appreciate your feedback and any sorts of thoughts on how to make things a little bit more effective, anything that you thought that we missed out on or could explain a little bit better, or spend a little less time on. And then the next video in this sequence is going to be a quick showcase of the neo debates and why they're important to policy making, and then quickly cover functionalism and quickly cover constructivism. So thanks for watching, and join us next time on Political Viewpoint.